and they were just like big and weird, and there was like a kiddie pool and a bunch of bubbles and like coloring. And I realized in retrospect it's because like I was very much throwing like a children's party. Like, what if a toddler had a birthday party thrown by a stripper? Like, that's what it ended up being. So it was like this weird mixture of like wild, because there's like, you know, girls writhing around in the pool, and there's like go-go dancers up on stage, but it's all of these like little children's things, and it's just like, this is all my favorite stuff. Let's do a party that's all about just stuff we like.
Got that good gon' ruin my pain, ruin my pain, ruin my pain, ruin my pain. Up 2 days and she won't make plans, won't make plans, won't make plans, won't make plans.
My name is Dr. Timaree, and I live in Philadelphia. So I grew up in western Nebraska in a very, very small town. And when I say small, I mean about like 24,000. And the nearest town that was of a comparable size was 96 miles away. So I was an only child, and I had a lot of stuffed animals as friends. And it was very rural, and that's incredibly lonely. It's an incredibly lonely way to come up. So I am an only child. I have 2 parents who still live in my hometown. They are both very educated and progressive people, especially in contrast to the rest of the community around them. They are far more socially and politically leftist than the people around them. And they're very interested in learning more. My house was filled with books. So as a little kid, I grew up doing a lot of reading, doing a lot of like watching foreign films and documentaries, and that's the kind of stuff that they were interested in, things that I gravitated towards. I credit those things with my not only like interests that I have now and my love of education, but also just with giving me a sense of where I was, what I was growing up with is not the whole world. And I'm super grateful for that. My parents were very, very big on instilling in me a self-reliance. If I had a question like, Dad, what does this word mean? He'd be like, how would you figure that out if I weren't here? And I'd be like, I'd probably go to the dictionary. He'd be like, why don't you do that? And then I go to the dictionary. And I'd be like, Dad, there's a thing that's really high. Will you help me get it down? And he'd be like, how would a monkey solve this problem? And I was like, probably throw stuff at it, but instead I would like climb up on things and get it down. And so I was instilled with this sense of like, you can figure this out. You don't, you don't need anybody. You're smart and you're capable and you're creative and there are answers. You just have to like put some brain power to it. So I spent a lot of my formative years doing like weird things. Like I wrote plays that I would put on in my backyard, would do a lot of drawing and writing and just creating things to entertain myself and to inspire myself in like occupations I wanted to have. I never had one particular thing I wanted to do. I wanted to do a million things. So I just sort of was always preparing to be an adult. I was so looking forward to that. There's a lot of people who talk about their childhoods with this like whimsy and this like nostalgia and they miss it. And I don't understand that at all. Like nothing about being a kid is fun to me because like somebody else gets to tell you everything, what you're gonna wear, what you're gonna eat, where you have to go. I was so looking forward to being an adult and being able to like create a life of my own choosing. I was a very old child. My first time doing burlesque, I stumbled upon it very randomly. I had never seen a burlesque show when I was in my first burlesque show. So I think that's a lot of hubris. But, my girlfriend at the time found an audition, I think it was like on Craigslist, to be a part of a show that was put on by the Cabaret Red Light. They were a troupe that created long form burlesque shows rather than just like individual variety acts. It was like a big scripted show that took place on a big stage. I believe there was a live band. The show that I was in was specifically called Lust, and it all had to do with rules, legislation around sexuality. So it was like a really, really incredibly good fit for me. I was opened up to the possibilities of burlesque as an art form in a way that I think is difficult to convey how meaningful it was to me, because a lot of what people see is just like a 5-minute act and then it's over, unrelated 5-minute act, it's over, or else the show has some sort of theme like all the characters are from E.T. or whatever. But that was really groundbreaking for me to see the possibilities of burlesque as this agitprop, subversive, satirical, political, narrative art form that really changed the game for me. And I was a small piece of it. We were doing a can number, so I had to learn a lot of choreography, and I was with a lot of people who had decades of dance experience. And I had dance experience, but like at the club, like not modern, not ballet, not lyrical, jazz, contemporary, like, so it was a real struggle for me to keep up with those performers. I was taking classes and stuff to try to do so because I wanted to be better, but there's only so much I could do in that short amount of time. So I only got so much better. But I just had to really work so hard to remember choreography compared to the other people in the cast. And there was this sense of it being just really, really exciting to me, and being surrounded by these people who just like, it just seemed like they had their stuff so together. And I was just so inspired and wanted to keep doing it. And it didn't, at the time, the scene was largely like troops. So you had to come through a troupe. So there weren't a ton of opportunities for me as an individual performer who wasn't in a troupe. So I sort of had to make those myself. And without anybody's approval and without any knowledge of what I was doing, I immediately started producing after that. So I credit that experience with being just so good that I had a taste for it, and I just had to keep going. So it's difficult to answer the first time that I did sexuality education, because to be very real, I was always doing it. As a kid, I was just reading about sex and I was very interested in it. And so I did a lot of educating my peers. And I know that most people learn from their friends, but I'm a nerd. And so I would give like book information, not like street smart, like I know what I'm talking about from experience. No, I had no experience, but I had read all the books. And so I could offer advice on, like how lube is useful and things that will and won't cause pregnancy and stuff like that. So those were the first times. The first time I had like a legit gig was I was an HIV prevention counselor. This was when I was an undergrad. So I was still technically a teenager, and I was a part of an organization that was just, we would do talks on healthy relationships, STIs, contraception, there's just like a whole menu of things that we could go out and do. And then I would also do HIV testing. So somebody would come in and we'd have a one-on-one educational experience where I hear what their current risk factors are, like the things that, just put them at risk for HIV. And then we have a conversation about ways that they can reduce or minimize the amount of risk. So I'm not telling them what to do. I'm not, like a counselor in the way that like we're going to get to the root causes of your emotions or whatever, but I can help you navigate making safer choices and minimizing risk and that sort of thing. And that one-on-one experience is really intense. To be let in to somebody's life in that way feels very, I'm overwhelmed by the trust that we get. And I hope to live up to that Because the thing about sexuality is it's not really taboo to have sex, but it's very taboo to talk about it openly. And when you exist in this schema where my label is sex educator, folks who I barely know will let me in on stuff that they don't tell their partners, that they don't tell their friends, they don't tell their family, they don't tell people, because it's like there's too much fear around the way someone will react. And I'm just, every single time, I mean, I find it a little bit funny, but I just like the fact that a stranger's telling me things. But I'm always just so honored that I'm being let in to people's lives in that way. And I really hope that I'm able to impart some sort of information that will be useful to them. And it has always felt that way. And I hope it always does. So when I was in high school, what I thought I was going to do is be a cinematographer. I was super interested in that. I had some friends with whom I would make films, and I was the camera bitch. That was my role. And I loved that. I thought that was very cool. And my plan was, I had picked what schools I was going to go to and the whole thing. And what I wanted to do was make documentaries. I wanted to make TV, like for the History Channel, or make movies and stuff like that. And then I was dating somebody who said in passing that so-and-so's mom is a sex therapist. And I was like, that's a job? It was unfamiliar to me. Like, I didn't, in my hometown, that did not exist. I'd never heard of such a thing. And once I heard that that was a job, I was like, well, skip all of those other plans. This is what I'm doing. And I've realized since then I don't want to be a therapist. That's not necessarily my jam. I am an educator. But in retrospect, like, I see all of these influences that led me towards this way. And the first one is, of course, just that I'm, like, very comfortable with sexuality and I'm a nerd. So I think the biggest factor about whether or not someone should go into sexuality on a professional level is just that, like, you're not squeamish around it. And I think it's the same thing for a lot of medical people. If you can look at a surgery and you don't get like, oh, no, then you know that you have a possibility there. You have an option maybe to start pursuing that because on a base level, you have a comfort with the content. And I was always drawn to very sexual content as a kid. I mean, most kids are because it's interesting. But my approach to it was always very nerdy. I was reading about ancient Greek sexual and romantic and marriage practices in elementary school because that was interesting to me. Like, that's very dorky. And I was reading about like concepts that I now realize are like about sexual orientation and behavior versus identity and things like that we didn't even necessarily have the framework for. I was reading about that in comics, in history books, I would look into it in musicals, stuff like that. I also look back and I see where I got a lot of burlesque influence because a lot of, like, my mother is very into theater and musical theater, and she would have films on and I would go to shows where there was a version of sexuality and these characters that existed in there that are now, I realize, archetypes that I see and go towards in burlesque. These powerful women who use sexuality and enjoy sexuality and don't allow themselves to be marginalized by it, and seeing queerness in these forms of media and seeing queerness in old movies that, like, wasn't overtly described as such at the time, but gravitating towards that anyway. So there were a lot of different influences that came together to make me find all of this stuff that I now find super interesting. So when I was an HIV prevention counselor, one of the parts of my job was administering an HIV test. And at the time, because this was almost 2 decades ago, the technology was very different. We had to send them away initially. It was 2 weeks before I could give somebody a result, which is, if you've ever taken an HIV test in that time period, that is an incredibly strained couple of weeks. And would have been a part of my job to give out a positive diagnosis and to have a conversation with a person about next steps. Simply by the nature of where I was, I didn't ever have to give that result, but we were trained and prepared for that sort of situation. And a big part of being a sexuality professional is being prepared to talk about difficult news, to talk about trauma, to talk about things that have a lot of stigma around them. So, like, one thing that, HIV is a very different reality now because it's so much has changed. And at the time, it felt much more like a death sentence. And now it's much more like a manageable chronic condition that's, we have PrEP, if you're not already familiar. It's a pre-exposure prophylaxis. You can take a pill every day that will reduce the likelihood of getting HIV, even if you're exposed to the virus. So that wasn't a reality back then, but that game has totally changed. But there are still lots of things that are really tough. And I think one of them is like when people find out they have like herpes. And a lot of folks have herpes but don't know it. They're asymptomatic. The symptoms that they had, they don't recognize as being herpes because the only images they've ever seen are like really horrific, very obviously visual things. Like they were shown in school, like, this is what will happen to you. And those are cases where somebody didn't get medical treatment for years on end and had a particularly bad flare-up at the time they took the picture. And it's, it's meant to scare kids because that's what we do in sex education in America. It's just mostly scare them, not actually teach them anything useful. So there's a lot of talking to people about reframing this and understanding that this is not the end of anything. They will still go on and find love and fulfilling lives, and everything is going to be fine. And even though we don't have a cure for herpes, like that, this isn't the end of your sex life, anything like that. So that's a very difficult conversation to have because that is so counter to the narrative in the culture. But it's also it's the truth. Like, so that's a tough one. And another piece of trauma that often comes up is stuff around like sexual assault, because people will tell me their stories. People I don't know will reach out, and I will have long, very intimate conversations about their trauma. It's not always just questions. It's not always fun stuff. It's also those things as well. And again, I appreciate being let in. I appreciate being trusted with that stuff. There is not always much I can do for people. I mean, I can point them towards resources, and those things may be useful, like finding solidarity, finding survivors groups, finding books that help you understand how trauma is stored in the body and ways that you can use meditation and other things like that to feel more mastery over the way that you physically feel that trauma impacts you. So there are things that can be helpful, but a lot of that stuff, it's just a matter of listening, believing, and being available. That's a lot of being a sexuality educator. A lot of working in the sexuality field, and the helping fields in general, is just like being present and giving people permission to love themselves, reminding them that they're worth that. There are a ton of burlesque inspirations for me, people that blow my mind or have shaped the way that I pursue things. Someone who didn't come across my radar initially when I got started, because I just didn't even know where to look. I didn't know where to get burlesque education very well. But I am now a huge fan of, and got to meet in person, is Camille 2000. And Camille 2000 is still alive. She's battling breast cancer, but she is still alive. And again, got to meet her. Bought some of her pictures and signed and stuff. So she was doing like classic burlesque, like the kind that you think of with like the feather fans and the, that whole thing. And she's, just a beautiful, blonde, busty, all of the things that you would imagine from burlesque of decades ago. But then she was noticing that because of the rise of strip clubs, which were sort of a new invention and sort of an offshoot from burlesque, that people were going more to these like live nude girl shows and less to burlesque. And she's like, well, we got to adapt if we want to keep audiences. And so she did. And she created this thing called I believe she called it aggressive art. It's a form of like performance art. So she was doing things that were like an homage to the Marquis de Sade, so very BDSM focused. And she was doing things where it was like, you know, bloody and weird and a mixture of other things besides just titillation and, you know, beauty. And that, I mean, was a really big part of like changing the game and allowing burlesque to adapt to survive. So I just really appreciate not only that content, because I really like that content is of interest to me, but also just the idea that just because we have done it this way doesn't mean that this is the way we should be doing it tomorrow. And I think that's a really big, important piece for people in any art form, in any science, you know, just because tradition is not a reason to do something, actually. It's very rarely a good reason to do things, because I think we have to constantly be reassessing and be like, are our processes serving us? What are the reasons that we do these things? Because we end up just recreating practices based on the fact that like we assume it will succeed because it was successful before, but not understanding why it was successful. And I'm very, very big on that introspection and that like breaking down into components to figure out what do I need to do so that I get to keep doing this. And Camille is a great example of that. And she says things that I absolutely disagree with. She's kind of a problematic person in some ways because she's feisty. Like, she threatens to cut people. She's a feisty one. She's a rock star. But she also will say things like, don't do floor work, which is where you're like on the floor when you're doing burlesque. And I just like, that's kind of my whole deal. So we can disagree, you know, I can disagree on stuff. But I can still have just like a tremendous amount of reverence for what she did to make it possible for me to get to do what I'm doing now. The panda bitch. So the origin story of my panda situation, and I am a very serious person about pandas. I was doing an act for a show that was brand new at the time. It's now been going for almost 3 years. It's called Agitated. It's an all politics, drag, and burlesque show that I do with my friend Polar Salt. And I wanted to do a number to the song Panda by Designer about panda conservation. So there's like a PowerPoint going on in the background about panda facts. And then I perform dressed as a panda to the song Panda. And in the process of doing a bunch of research on them, I discovered I love pandas. I think they are the best. They are like giant drunken toddler bears. And they just fall all the time. And they're so like just klutzy and weird and cuddly, and every fact about them is super interesting. They just are profoundly strange animals. And a good friend of mine, the amazing Brezzo, bought me a giant panda head because it's like a thing I believe in Japan to wear like big animal heads like that. And I was super into it. I really liked having this head, and it weirded people out because there's a panda head, and I would almost always be wearing like burlesque attire when I would have it on. And the juxtaposition of like naked lady body and panda head is so many feelings at the same time. And so for absolutely no good reason, just decided to form a party around it. So I threw like 3 or 4 panda bitch parties at Ruba Club, and they were just like big and weird, and there was like a kiddie pool and a bunch of bubbles and like coloring. And I realized in retrospect it's because like I was very much throwing like a children's party. Like, what if a toddler had a birthday party thrown by a stripper? Like, that's what it ended up being. So it was like this weird mixture of like wild, because there's like, you know, girls writhing around in the pool, and there's like go-go dancers up on stage. But it's all of these like little children's things, and it's just like, this is all my favorite stuff. Let's do a party that's all about just stuff we like. So that was that. And then like to promote the party, we started doing these photo shoots with a few different friends, including this one. So it was just weird and very memorable for folks when they would see it. Politics. So another one of my nerdy things about me when I was a little kid, I read a lot of news. I read newspapers every day. My parents had like Newsweek come to the house and, other things like that and other news magazines. And it was always interesting to me. And I think part of it is just wanting to understand the world around me and why things happen the way they do, and coming to understand how much desire for power is ultimately the reason that individual human beings experience what they do, like access to housing and access to healthcare and education, and so much of like our daily lives and the way that our government is structured and the way that our day-to-day lives are impacted simply because there are specific people out there who are interested in power and money and things like that, and trying to understand it from a structural perspective. And to say that you're not interested in politics is like a thing that people will say, but that to me is like you don't want to understand the forces around you. It feels like if you don't have to think about it, then it won't impact you. But the reality is we feel these repercussions. Like I have healthcare right now because of the Affordable Care Act. I wouldn't have it otherwise. And that is just a small example, just a tiny day-to-day thing that exists because of battling forces well beyond my individual reach. But I want to understand it, and I want to understand what I can do on an individual level to impact these issues that matter to me, that affect other voters' access to fight things like gerrymandering, to fight things like voter intimidation, to fight things like purging voter rolls of people of color, felon disenfranchisement, making it an issue that somebody have the exact name, or disenfranchising trans folks because of their names. And there's just all of these small, tiny ways that individual people get their power taken away from them because someone else wants to be able to keep a different and larger type of power. So I think not everybody wants to spend time thinking about that because it is depressing, because it feels overwhelming and like we can't do much, especially in 2018 where we all just, it's like every day, every day is so much worse than any point in like our lives previously in a lot of ways. But America's always been a mess. America's always been bad to large swaths of people. It was never easy to be, like a First Nations, like indigenous person here. It's been awful since white people showed up. So this isn't new. It's just so fast. It's just happening so fast now. That's all. So I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in talking about that with anybody, including people who wildly disagree with me. But it's harder now because people disagree with like facts, like whether or not science is a thing, and that becomes harder when people aren't meeting you from a place of like mutual interest in the truth. They're meeting you from a place of like, we are on competing teams and this is football, and every bit of ground that you cede is ground that I then have, or vice versa. And it's not that, because we all will suffer the repercussions of the decisions of these people who don't know what they're doing and are just interested in power. All right, so favorite, most influential album. My favorite song, and this is just a decided fact, this will continue to be a fact, is Fast Car by Tracy Chapman, and it is off of the self-titled album. It like came out in '88. I discovered that song as a little kid. It came out when I was a little kid, and it still impacts me. I could still listen to it and cry. The story behind it is, I don't know that it's necessarily like uniquely a Black woman in America story, but I think that, I mean, having Tracy Chapman be the voice of it certainly gives it that feeling, and it gives it a distinctly like American feel to it. And it's about like a hope that exists well beyond evidence in circumstances that are just depressing and real, super real. And there's something about the way that she carries the hope in her voice over the refrain that's just so understandable, especially for like a person from a small town, and seeing how different lives go, the trajectories of people based on their opportunities and based on their responsibilities and the things that they get caught up in. And it's just such a like a real core life trajectory and hope in the face of dauntingness that I got to hear it live one time. I got to hear Tracy Chapman live one time at the Tower and definitely cried. Just a full-blown heaving, sobbing, because it was amazing. So that whole album's full of songs that I will listen to still to this day. That album is 30 years old. Yeah, that's real. I think the concept of having a favorite movie is funny. Same with having a favorite song, because it's like there's always so much stuff that impacts us. But I have decided that my favorite movie is Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. And it is a Guy Ritchie film. It's somewhere between like a heist film and like just a weird British crime film. And I very much like heist movies where it's like a bunch of people like planning together to pull off some sort of lucrative criminal endeavor. It speaks to my soul. But that particular one, I just gravitated towards it as a kid because it came out like in the 90s when it blew my mind stylistically. It looked very gritty and cool. It was like a music video combined with heist, and everybody had an accent, and that was when Jason Statham wasn't famous. And it's funny. I still think it's funny. I think the lines are funny. It's weird when I think about how many of my favorite films growing up like have basically no women in them, like effectively no women, and that's just like the reality of being a woman and growing up and just not seeing representation in film. But I still just like am entertained by it. I still like turning people on to it. It never got overplayed, so it still feels like it's mine. Because I think one of the problems is like if anything gets too popular and it doesn't feel like yours anymore, then it's like, no, those people suck. They don't get to like that. But Lock, Stock is still pretty obscure, and I don't think it's going to get any more famous. So sticking with that answer. When I was growing up, I assume it was my mom that bought it. There was a print of Ecstasy by Maxfield Parrish. It is a very colorful, I don't know what the exact medium was, like if it was paint or drawing or whatever, but it's a very colorful image of a woman standing on, this is my recollection of it, I don't have it in front of me, where she seems sort of like on an edge, and it's like windy, and she's like got the breeze like blowing through her hair, and she's got these like sort of roby dress on that's flying back behind her. It's very colorful and I think sensual. I mean, a woman, and it's called Ecstasy. That's kind of obvious. And I don't know anything about the history. I haven't really looked into it. That is a thing that I probably should do if I'm going to be talking about it. But I just saw it every day because it was in my house, and my mom had a lot of like cool, weird art that featured women and sensuality, which impacted who I am today. And so growing up with an image of a woman having pleasure that didn't rely on anybody else or money or, validation or, it wasn't buying things. It wasn't, any of those sources of excitement that we tend to chase. Instead, she was just like in the passionate throes of responding to nature being around her and her own body. And I just love that. And that has shaped so much of it's just a paragon of the things that I'm about ultimately, and finding pleasure in our own bodies, allowing ourselves that experience. So I spend a lot of time teaching people about pleasure being innately valuable, and it not having to produce something or being lucrative or justifying it through anything else other than the fact that it makes you happy. So that comes to mind immediately. Intended to give people hope, misused as a means of social control. The basic core function of all life. The means through which I most enjoyably experience the world. Being able to make choices for yourself. Wanting someone else to be happy. Being threatened by something real or imaginary. The people who will show up. So, a piece of advice that I would have is, I didn't come up with this, this is just something that has been conveyed to me and been useful to me, is to approach the world from a beginner's mindset. The expert is the person who knows a lot, and they see fewer options for how to proceed in a situation because they have already seen this doesn't work, this works, this doesn't work, this works. They know all these factors already. And the nice thing about an expert is they have a lot of information, but the nice thing about a beginner is that they see possibilities. And as you learn and as you get more experience, to continue to view everything from the perspective of someone who just started out, who doesn't know everything, and who is really interested in seeing how things can be different and what is possible. Humble with a hint of Kanye.
Myself when we doing our thing, doing our thing, doing our thing, doing our thing.